Hey everybody, welcome to Monday. I'm going to carry on talking about making things different depending on who you're making an offer to or who you're selling to, what you're offering. Today, as Christy posted in the intro, I'm going to talk about what happens after you've already engaged a customer. And preferably this doesn't actually happen after you've engaged a customer. You think about it well in advance and come up with a plan for how are you going to deliver, whether it's a product or a service, to the customer that you're delivering to. And what I'm suggesting is that you should have at least a couple of different levels of service or different levels of product, depending on who you're working for. What I've experienced working with a whole range of small businesses who are gradually increasing their scope and their business is that as you start working with larger and larger clients, they have increasingly higher expectations. They pay more money, but they have higher expectations for what you do in return for the money. So you have to think in advance, what am I going to do to make sure that I meet and preferably slightly exceed the expectations of every client that I work with, whether they're small, one-person business that's paying you a few $100s, or whether they're large 100 to 1,000 person business that's paying you tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. Their expectations are going to be slightly different each way up the scale. So those kinds of things, the expectations of change can be anything from expecting you to provide more documentation when you are delivering a service, or expecting you to move more quickly or move more slowly. It's not probably too surprising to draw the conclusion that smaller businesses will usually expect a lot less from a documentation perspective. Bigger businesses will expect more. Smaller businesses will usually want you to move faster, and bigger businesses will be okay with you moving slower. The contrast to that is that often, if you're a service provider working with a small business, you'll find that they're really, really busy and they don't actually want you to be in their face 8 hours a day. They want you to be in and out a couple of hours a week rather than being with them all the time. Where when you work with a large business, and especially if you work with government, they're much more likely to expect you to behave almost like an employee does and turn up and be there from the start of the day to the end of the day, every single day until the work is complete. So understanding in advance how you're going to manage that, whether or not you need to have a different approach to scheduling, whether or not you need to have a different approach to staffing, is really important to make sure that when you do start doing the work, you can meet everybody's expectations, not just the expectations of the customer, but also the expectations of your staff. If you've got people in your team that have never worked for large organisations, they've only worked for residential or domestic customers, then they're going to have a completely different set of expectations. So again, really important that you've sat down and thought about before you start a piece of work, what's the customer going to expect, and how do you make sure that you and your team are well prepared to deliver, like I said before, at least at expectations, but preferably slightly above expectations, so that everybody's happy that what you're doing is what's necessary and what's useful. So a couple of things that you can do to make it easy to make sure that you are going to meet your customers' expectations. The first one's really obvious. Just ask them. If you haven't worked with a certain type of customer before, ask them what they're expecting when you're starting out, preferably before you start the job, but at least when you start the job, make sure that there's really clear understanding. And the second thing that you can do is sit down and plan out, what are you going to do? What have you done in the past? What are you going to do differently this time if you're working with a new set of clients? My last tip or suggestion, if you are working with a whole range of different types of clients, large ones and small ones, it's worthwhile every now and again sitting down and having a think about, is the way that you're doing your work actually working across all of the clients that you work with. And maybe you need to take some of your more complicated processes and make them simpler for the clients that want you to move a little faster. And maybe you need to add in some checks and balances for the clients that want you to be more certain, but are prepared to pay a little bit more and have you move a little bit more slowly. That's everything that I had to talk about today. Next week, I'm going to talk about the all-important aspect of working with different clients, which is money. I'm working with a whole bunch of clients at the moment that have told me that as they work with larger and larger organisations, cash flow becomes more and more difficult. So I'm going to bring a tool with me next week and introduce how you can forecast what your cash flow is going to be, and just remind everybody that understanding cash is really, really important when you start working with larger clients who have different terms and different expectations. See everybody next week.